AP 120, Lab 13, Topics, Digestive System. So, as we know, the digestive system is a 30-foot long tube extending from the mouth to the anus, and we can refer to the digestive tract as the alimentary canal. So, it's also known as the alimentary canal. There are, besides the digestive tract itself, various accessory organs that are important for aiding in mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical, breaking big things into smaller things, and chemical, breaking big molecules into smaller molecules. So the alimentary canal starts with the oral cavity that then goes to the pharynx, from there the esophagus, through the thoracic cavity down to the stomach in the abdominal cavity. Then you have the small intestine broken up into the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And from there you have the large intestine, which gets broken down into the cecum with the little appendix hanging off of it, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, the anal canal, and the anus. That is all of the major parts of the alimentary canal. For accessory organs, these include the salivary glands, the right and left parotid salivary glands near the ear, the right and left sublingual salivary glands below the tongue, the right and left submandibular salivary glands near the mandible, as well as the teeth and tongue, the liver down in the abdominal cavity, the gallbladder hanging off of the inferior surface of the liver, and the pancreas, which we can just barely see a part of, the pancreas being posterior to the stomach. So here's our lovely head model where you can see the parotid gland, which is on the lateral sides of our head near the ear. We, of course, have the tongue. Underneath the tongue is the sublingual glands, and then down below that is the submandibular glands. If we look at the oral cavity more carefully, we see that the hard palate makes up the majority of the roof of the oral cavity. It is hard because it has bone within it. And then the soft palate, which is mostly connective and muscular tissue, with that little bitty structure hanging down at the end called the uvula. The soft palate and the uvula are important because when we swallow, they prevent food from going up into the nasal cavity. We do not want food and drink to go up into the nasal cavity. Of course, we also have the teeth. So looking at this quarter jaw, so this is half of the mandible, which is 1/4 of the total teeth. We have in this half of a mandible 2 incisors that are anterior, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. In an adult who also has their wisdom teeth intact, they would have 8 incisors, 4 canines, 8 premolars, and 12 molars. Regions of the tooth. The portion of the tooth above the gum line is called the crown. The portion of the tooth below the gum line is the root. In terms of layers, the most superficial layer is the enamel. It's nice whitish in color. Below that is the dentin, which is slightly brown in color. It makes up the bulk of the tooth. And then deep to the dentin is the pulp, which is the living portion of the tooth with blood vessels, nerves, etc. The pulp is found in the pulp cavity as well as in the root canal. All right, moving on from the oral cavity, we lead to the pharynx. While there are 3 components to the pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, the digestive system only uses the oropharynx, coming directly after the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx directly above the larynx and esophagus. And so when we swallow, food will go from the oral cavity through the oropharynx to the laryngopharynx to the esophagus. The esophagus is posterior to the larynx and trachea. Esophagus then runs down in through the thoracic cavity, specifically the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. And then as it enters the abdominal cavity, it ends in a structure called the lower esophageal sphincter, which then leads to the stomach. So here is the stomach. We could cut this. This is the stomach cut in half. Here's the stomach intact in that upper left quadrant. The stomach has three main regions: the fundus, which is the hump, the body, which makes up the bulk of the stomach, and the pylorus, the little tail end. And the pylorus ends in the pyloric sphincter, which controls the movement of materials into the duodenum of the small intestine. Looking at the inner lining of the stomach, we see that it has all these little folds. They are called the rugae, one rugae, many rugae. They're important because they help allow the stomach to stretch. All right, from here in the abdominal cavity, we can see the liver with its large right lobe and somewhat smaller left lobe. Liver produces bile. We can see a piece of the gallbladder, which is green, and it stores bile. There's, of course, the stomach again. If we remove the liver and the stomach, we can then see the pancreas. Pancreas, this looks kind of like old cottage cheese. Pancreas produces digestive enzymes and bicarbonate to neutralize the acid from the stomach. Here is a pancreas model. So here, this brown tissue here represents a piece of the liver. Green here is the gallbladder, which then leads to the cystic duct. Coming out of the liver is the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct and the cystic duct fuse to form the common bile duct, which then travels down to the pancreas and to this sphincter, so that the bile can be sent into the duodenum. Here, of course, is the pancreas, and within the pancreas is the long pancreatic duct, which also leads to the sphincter to allow the release of the the pancreatic juice, which has the bicarbonate and the digestive enzymes. All right, here is the duodenum of the small intestine. It is the shortest part. Looks kind of like a C shape here. Duodenum then leads to the jejunum in the upper left quadrant, and then the jejunum leads to the ileum, which is mostly in the lower right quadrant. So food travels duodenum, jejunum, and then ileum. Here is a model of the wall of the small intestine. So we're looking at a cross section of the wall of the small intestine. Up here is the lumen, the space inside of the small intestine. We see that it has four layers. The layer next to the open space is the mucosa layer. Below that is the submucosa layer, then the muscularis layer, and then finally the serosa layer. The mucosa layer includes these finger-like projections called the villi, one villus, many villi. Within the villus, you see the blood capillaries, shown in red, and also the lacteal, part of the lymphatic system, shown in green. Here again is the submucosa layer, where we find the lymph nodule. So there's lymphatic tissue, the lymph nodule, within the submucosa layer. The muscularis layer includes the circular layer, which goes around the small intestine, and the longitudinal layer, which runs along the length of the small intestine. And then finally, we have the serosa, the outermost layer. All right, then we have the large intestine. When I talk about the entire organ, it's the large intestine. When I talk about parts of it, it's often referred to as the colon. So this compartment here is the cecum, single small compartment. This portion of the large intestine is called the ascending colon. Feces will be traveling up the right side. Then it will cross from right to left via the transverse colon. Then the feces will travel down the left side via the descending colon. From there, you get the sigmoid colon, which would then, if we could see it, but we can't, would lead to the rectum and anus. Again, the very first compartment of the large intestine is the cecum. Here's the end of the ileum. Here is the ileocecal sphincter that controls the movement of material from the ileum into the cecum. Down here, hanging off the cecum, is the appendix, cecum, ileocecal sphincter. All right, these little this strip of whitish tissue running along the length of the large intestine, that is smooth muscle tissue, and it's called the tinea coli. Contractions of the tinea coli form these little pouches, which are referred to as a hostrum. So one hostrum, many hostra. So here's a hostrum, here's a hostrum, here's a hostrum. And then finally, this tissue here is part of the peritoneum. Specifically, it is the mesentery, which connects to the small and large intestines and also carries blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels to and from the small and large intestines. All right, so here's the large intestine ends in one big piece with the appendix, the cecum, the ileocecal sphincter carrying materials into the cecum. Then we have, of course, the pouches are the hostrum. The strip of tissue along the length is the tinea coli. We have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, where feces is stored, the anal canal, and then the anus. And that is it for this lecture.